I am Justice Lorraine Hayes. This is my son's funeral. You are making a grave mistake.
Okay, I don't care who you say you are. Badge looks fake. Turn around now.
You are arresting a black mother at her child's funeral.
The humid Atlanta afternoon felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Justice Lorraine Hayes stood beside the polished mahogany casket of her only son, Dr. Aaron Hayes. The grief in her chest was raw, sharp, impossible to hide, yet she maintained her composure. Her black mourning dress and simple pearls a quiet armor against the world. Every eye in the cemetery chapel should have been on the solemn burial ahead. Not on the mother, not on the Supreme Court justice grieving her child. But the world had other plans that day. Lorraine had spent 28 years shaping Georgia law, writing opinions that would guide the state for decades. She had argued civil rights cases, reformed criminal sentencing, and fought to protect those without a voice. She had earned respect from colleagues, law students, and judges alike. But none of that mattered when a man decided, in an instant, that she didn't belong. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring the truth to light. The Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens sprawled across 40 acres in northeast Atlanta, its centuries-old oak trees casting dappled shadows over pristine lawns. The main chapel, a white colonial revival building, gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Inside, 200 mourners filled the pews. 3 former governors, 2 U.S. senators, Atlanta's mayor, federal judges, state legislators, doctors, law professors, and friends of the Hayes family. The air was heady with grief, whispered condolences, and the faint scent of flowers. Lorraine had delivered the eulogy 20 minutes earlier, speaking of her son's brilliance, his dedication to healing, and the love he showed his own children. Aaron had been a cardiologist at Emory University Hospital, only 35, taken suddenly by a cardiac event 6 days before. Her voice had been steady despite the heartbreak, her composure masking the storm inside. She had walked down from the podium and taken her seat at the front row, her eyes following the pallbearers as they prepared to carry the casket outside. Edward Shields, the funeral director, watched closely from the chapel entrance. He was meticulous, obsessed with protocol, and prone to seeing irregularities where none existed. To him, someone didn't fit the proper image of a mourner at eternal rest, and in his mind, that was cause for alarm. Lorraine's presence, a black woman in the front row, walking beside the casket, didn't fit the pattern he expected. He picked up the phone and called the Georgia State Patrol dispatcher. Officer Ryan Callahan, 38, had been on the force for 11 years. He had been commended for professionalism, but had a record of complaints for racial profiling and excessive force, complaints that were mostly ignored or settled quietly. That afternoon, he received the call from Shields about an unauthorized person disrupting a private service. Callahan's eyes scanned the cemetery from his patrol car and landed on Lorraine Hayes standing by her son's casket. His mind, shaped by assumptions, decided quickly she did not belong. He walked toward her, uniform pressed, badge gleaming, hand ready at his belt. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the casket," he said. Lorraine turned, confusion flashing across her face. "I'm his mother," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Callahan's eyes hardened, his jaw tight. "The family is inside. Whoever you are, this is a private service." "I am the family," Lorraine said, gesturing toward the casket. "I am Justice Lorraine Hayes. This is my son." "You're not Justice Hayes," he said flatly. A hush fell over the crowd. Phones were lifted. Cameras clicked. Lorraine's face tightened with disbelief. She lifted the laminated judicial ID hanging from her neck. "This is my ID. I am a Supreme Court justice. I am his mother." Callahan barely glanced at the badge. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave now before this becomes a problem. Lorraine's grief boiled into controlled fury. My son died 6 days ago. I've served this state for 30 years, and you're telling me I cannot attend his funeral. Callahan moved his hand to his cuffs. Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back. The crowd erupted in protest. Voices rose in shock and disbelief. She's on the Supreme Court, someone shouted. Lorraine's eyes locked on him, cold and commanding. You are arresting me at my son's funeral. I will comply under protest. I want every witness to note this is unlawful. The cold click of the metal handcuffs echoed as he gripped her wrists tighter than necessary. She winced but did not cry out. Edward Shields stood back, suddenly pale, realizing the chaos he had unleashed. Around them, mourners whispered, some crying, others filming. Former governors and senators were visibly shocked. The funeral, meant to be solemn and private, had become a spectacle of humiliation. 11 minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Brenda Foster arrived. She was a 24-year veteran, the highest-ranking woman in the Georgia State Patrol. She had seen mistakes and misconduct before, but nothing like this. Her eyes swept the scene. The patrol car, the crowd, the restrained justice. Her expression hardened into a mix of fury and disbelief. What happened here? She demanded. Callahan straightened. Funeral director called about an unauthorized person. She refused to leave. She claimed to be Justice Hayes. I placed her under arrest for trespassing and obstruction. Did you verify her identity? Foster asked, her voice sharp. She showed me a badge. Looked fake, Callahan stammered. Foster's eyes narrowed. She opened the patrol car door, examining Lorraine's face, the badge, and her composure. Then she pulled up the Georgia Supreme Court website and confirmed her identity. Her expression turned cold. You arrested a sitting Supreme Court justice at her son's funeral after she presented valid credentials. Foster's voice cut across the cemetery. Callahan's face drained of color. The funeral director said, I don't care what he said. You verify before you arrest, Foster interrupted. You don't handcuff a Supreme Court justice at her child's funeral because of your assumptions. Foster removed Lorraine's handcuffs, allowing her to rub her wrists, red from the tight metal. On behalf of the Georgia State Patrol, this is inexcusable. Lorraine stepped out, dignified despite the marks on her skin. She turned to the crowd, to Callahan, and to the casket of her son. The burial could finally continue, but the humiliation and injustice of that moment had already been recorded by dozens of witnesses. Within minutes, videos of the arrest went viral. The outrage was immediate. Legal organizations demanded accountability. Media outlets replayed the handcuffing, the refusal to acknowledge her credentials, and the public shaming of a Supreme Court justice at her child's funeral. Callahan was placed on administrative leave. Shields was fired. The patterns of bias and misconduct that had been ignored for years were suddenly undeniable. Yet, as justice seemed poised to take its course, one truth remained. Nothing could restore the 15 minutes Lorraine lost beside her son before his burial. Nothing could erase the public humiliation. And nothing could undo the reminder that, even at the pinnacle of her career, her race made her a target for assumptions and injustice. The burial site was under a crisp white tent, 30 yards from the chapel, where the final farewell to Dr. Aaron Hayes would take place. Lorraine Hayes walked toward the casket, her head held high, her black dress moving with quiet authority. The crowd parted for her, still in shock from the arrest they had witnessed. Phones were out, cameras still rolling, capturing her every step. What had been a private funeral was now a public spectacle, a scene that would haunt Georgia for years. Lieutenant Colonel Brenda Foster stayed close, her presence a silent shield. She'd handled countless high-pressure incidents, but she had never encountered an officer so blind to reality, so stubbornly guided by bias that he would arrest a Supreme Court justice at a child's funeral. She watched Lorraine approach the casket, her hands resting on the polished mahogany. Every mourner under the tent seemed frozen, unsure whether to mourn or protest, unsure whether the world had truly gone insane. Edward Shields, the funeral director, stood a few feet away, flustered and ashamed. The call he had made seemed, in hindsight, catastrophic. He had seen something in Lorraine Hayes that didn't match his mental image of who a Supreme Court justice should be. He had assumed she was an imposter. His assumptions had led to a chain reaction that humiliated a grieving mother and disrupted a ceremony meant to honor her son. Lorraine's mind raced, not with anger at this moment. She had long learned to control her emotions, but with disbelief at the layers of systemic failure she had just experienced. Officer Ryan Callahan had acted without verification. The funeral director had acted on racial bias, and she, the mother, had been powerless until the intervention of Foster. She took a deep breath and lowered her hands to her sides, steadying herself. The burial commenced. The casket was lowered slowly, ropes creaking under the weight of polished wood and grief. Lorraine stood beside it, silent, allowing the mourners to pay their respects. Every detail, the shovels of dirt, the ceremonial taps, the flowers laid atop the casket, was magnified by the public scrutiny. Cameras from smartphones captured the solemnity and the humiliation in the same frame. Every movement, every breath, was a reminder of the injustice she had endured minutes earlier. Meanwhile, the news cycle had already exploded. Within 30 minutes, videos of her arrest circulated across local news stations, social media platforms, and national networks. The hashtag #JusticeFuneral began trending. Outrage poured in from all directions. Commentators and civil rights groups highlighted not just the arrest, but the clear pattern of bias that Officer Callahan represented. 9 complaints in 11 years, 3 sustained, multiple allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. Ignored until they targeted someone with the power to challenge the system. Back at the cemetery, Foster approached Lorraine quietly once the casket was in place. "Ma'am, I want to ensure you're safe for the remainder of the ceremony. We can handle any further issues immediately," she said, voice steady but firm. Lorraine nodded. "Thank you, Colonel. My priority is my son, but the world is watching. Every second of this, every second of my humiliation is recorded. We cannot let it go unnoticed." Foster's jaw tightened. "I understand. And it won't go unnoticed. Callahan will be held accountable. Shields is already off the property. We will document everything thoroughly." Lorraine glanced around at the mourners. Friends, colleagues, and family were stunned, but supportive. Their whispered reassurances were drowned out by the larger truth. This was not just a personal violation. It was a statement about the state of law enforcement in Georgia. Even someone with her credentials and authority could be publicly treated as a criminal because of her race. After the burial, mourners began to leave, though many lingered to offer condolences. Lorraine stood near the tent, allowing herself a moment of private grief. She had just endured an arrest at her son's funeral, a moment so surreal it felt almost fictional. Yet, the red marks on her wrists and the memory of Callahan's cold, unyielding eyes proved otherwise. When the funeral ended, she and Foster walked together to a quiet area of the cemetery. Foster spoke first. "Justice Hayes, the moment Callahan stepped forward, I knew the situation was critical. He acted on assumptions, not facts. That is never acceptable. I've already submitted a full incident report, and I am personally recommending termination. This will not be swept under the rug." Lorraine exhaled slowly, trying to release the tightness in her chest. "Colonel, thank you. But I need more than just an internal report. 9 complaints, 3 sustained, years of documented behavior. This is systemic. Callahan's record should have prevented this long before today. My case is proof that the system allows people to remain in positions of authority despite repeated violations. Foster nodded, somber. Agreed. That's why this will be escalated to the Federal Civil Rights Division. We will ensure every aspect of this misconduct is reviewed. The system will have to answer for this one. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Officer Callahan was already facing the storm. His phone rang nonstop. Emails from supervisors, media inquiries, and internal affairs began stacking up. Every complaint, every sustained finding, every incident of racial bias in his history was being re-examined under the harsh light of public scrutiny. For the first time in 11 years, the consequences of his repeated failures were unavoidable. Lorraine, despite her grief, had begun planning her next steps. She reached out to civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, assembling a team of Georgia's top legal minds. Their mission: to hold Callahan, Shields, the Georgia State Patrol, and the state itself accountable. Her lawsuit would allege unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, excessive force, racial discrimination, violation of judicial independence, emotional distress, and failure to supervise an officer with a documented pattern of bias. The media coverage was relentless. Headlines screamed, "Supreme Court Justice arrested at son's funeral." "Georgia officer calls badge fake, arrests black judge." Funeral turns into public outrage over racial bias. The videos, taken by dozens of mourners, provided undeniable proof of the events. There was no room for doubt, no way to obscure the truth. As night fell on Atlanta, Lorraine returned home exhausted, emotionally drained, but unwavering. She knew the fight ahead would be long and arduous. The arrest was not just a personal violation. It was a public example of how racial assumptions could dictate law enforcement actions. She had to ensure that her experience led to systemic change, not just temporary outrage. Even in private, the echoes of the day's events resonated. Every glance at her wrist, still bearing the marks of the handcuffs, reminded her of the cost of bias and the fragility of justice in the absence of accountability. She vowed to turn that pain into action. By the following morning, news outlets had reached national audiences. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding federal investigations. Legal scholars weighed in, analyzing the implications for judicial independence and racial profiling in law enforcement. The Georgia Bar Association called the arrest unconscionable, and the governor personally reached out to Lorraine Hayes to apologize. For the first time, the gravity of the systemic failure was undeniable. The combination of Edward Shields' assumptions, Officer Ryan Callahan's biases, and years of ignored complaints created a perfect storm. And Lorraine Hayes, despite her credentials and decades of service, had become the face of the problem. A stark reminder that systemic change was long overdue. As she prepared for what would become a federal civil rights lawsuit, Lorraine knew the story was bigger than her son's funeral. It was a test of accountability in Georgia. It was a measure of whether repeated bias and misconduct would be tolerated or corrected. And it was a question every citizen had to consider. How many complaints were enough to remove an officer from duty? 3, 9, 10. Until systems were changed, she knew someone else would inevitably face what she had endured. Lorraine's mind, sharp and resolute even in grief, already began mapping out every legal argument, every violation, every precedent. She would not rest until justice extended beyond her case, beyond herself, beyond the $18 million settlement that would eventually be awarded. This was about changing the rules so that no other mother, no other mourner, no other citizen would be subjected to the same humiliation simply because of the color of their skin. The day after the funeral, Atlanta was still buzzing. Videos of Justice Lorraine Hayes' arrest had gone viral, shared across social media, local news, and national networks. Each clip told the same shocking story. A Supreme Court justice, handcuffed and pushed into a patrol car at her son's funeral, while an officer dismissed her credentials as fake. The outrage was immediate, relentless, and impossible to ignore. Lorraine sat in her office, reviewing the footage from multiple angles. She had paused, replayed, and scrutinized each second. Officer Ryan Callahan's hand on her arm, the handcuffs digging into her wrists, his flat, unyielding expression. Every detail reinforced the brutality of the moment. Even after 28 years on the bench, Lorraine had never imagined she would be treated like a criminal in front of 200 witnesses simply because of the color of her skin. Her phone rang. It was Benjamin Crump. "Justice Hayes," he said firmly, "we're ready to file. I've reviewed every complaint against Callahan, every incident at Eternal Rest, and every detail from the videos. This isn't just a wrongful arrest. This is a civil rights violation, plain and simple." "I know," Lorraine said, her voice steady. "And it's more than just him. Edward Shields, the funeral director, created the chain reaction that allowed this to happen. And the Georgia State Patrol's failure to act on his prior complaints, that's systemic. They all need to answer for it." "Exactly," Crump agreed. "We'll name Callahan, Shields, the Georgia State Patrol, the state of Georgia. Everyone. This lawsuit will hit every point of misconduct: false imprisonment, excessive force, racial profiling, violation of judicial independence, emotional distress. We will leave no stone unturned." Lorraine nodded, though a part of her still burned with grief. Aaron was gone. She had spent hours holding his casket, her hands pressed against the polished mahogany, knowing that just minutes earlier she had been handcuffed at his funeral. That memory, vivid and haunting, fueled her resolve. Justice would be more than words on paper. It would be a reckoning. Meanwhile, Officer Callahan sat at home, his uniform pressed and neatly folded on the chair beside him. His phone buzzed incessantly. Internal affairs inquiries, news updates, and messages from colleagues. His life, once orderly and predictable, had collapsed in a single afternoon. He had assumed he was doing his job, acting on a call. But that call, and his unquestioned assumptions, had destroyed him. Foster's investigation had begun immediately. Internal Affairs reviewed every complaint, every incident, every report in Callahan's file. 9 complaints over 11 years, 3 sustained, multiple allegations of racial bias and excessive force, all documented. Foster shook her head as she read through the patterns. This was not an isolated mistake. This was repeated misconduct, ignored until it targeted someone with power to fight back. Edward Shields tried to defend himself in a brief statement to the press. "I thought there was a discrepancy. I was maintaining order," he said. But the public was unforgiving. Social media users condemned him for racial profiling, for creating a scenario that humiliated a grieving mother. Within 36 hours, he was terminated from Eternal Rest Memorial Gardens. His name became synonymous with bias in funeral services, and he would face legal consequences in the coming lawsuit. Lorraine, Crump, and their legal team filed the federal lawsuit 3 weeks later in the Northern District of Georgia. The complaint was precise, scathing, and backed by irrefutable evidence. Videos, witness statements, officer complaint histories, and Shields' record. The claims were devastating. Unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, civil rights violations, racial profiling, violation of judicial independence, excessive use of force, emotional distress, and failure to supervise. Inside the Georgia State Patrol, the mood was tense. Command staff could no longer ignore Callahan's history. His prior complaints, once dismissed or minimized, were now under a microscope. Patterns emerged clearly. Black drivers disproportionately stopped. Black suspects treated more aggressively. Black victims dismissed or ignored. Each documented incident told the same story: and the chain reaction that led to Lorraine Hayes' arrest made it impossible to defend. Callahan issued a brief statement through his attorney. I made an error in judgment under difficult circumstances. I apologize to Justice Hayes and her family. The public rejected it instantly. An error in judgment could not erase the humiliation, the handcuffs, or the violation of civil rights. The apology was meaningless. Lorraine's story began gaining national attention. Talk shows, news outlets, and legal analysts discussed the implications. A sitting Supreme Court justice arrested at her son's funeral, handcuffed by an officer with a documented pattern of bias. The narrative was stark. Racial assumptions, unchecked power, systemic failure. The outrage was immediate, and people demanded action. 8 months later, Lorraine Hayes testified before a joint session of the Georgia legislature. The chamber was packed, her presence commanding attention. She stood at the podium, dark blue suit, composed but intense. I am Justice Lorraine Hayes, she began. I have served on the Georgia Supreme Court for 28 years. I have authored 340 majority opinions. I have been retained in 4 elections by an average margin of 72%. I have dedicated my adult life to this state's legal system. She paused. Every eye in the chamber was on her. On September 14th, I stood beside my son's casket at his funeral. I wore my judicial ID badge around my neck, visible. I showed it to Officer Callahan. I identified myself repeatedly. I am Justice Lorraine Hayes. This is my son. I am his mother. Another pause. She let the weight of her words sink in. Officer Callahan looked at my credentials and called them fake. He arrested me. He handcuffed me. He pushed me into a patrol car. He did this in front of 200 witnesses, including 3 former governors of the state. He did this at my son's funeral. He did this because when he looked at me, he saw a black woman, and his bias told him that a black woman could not be a Supreme Court justice. The chamber was silent. Every legislator, every reporter, every aide absorbed her words. Callahan had 9 complaints in 11 years. 9. 3 sustained. Multiple allegations of racial profiling. Multiple allegations of excessive force. The pattern was clear, and yet he remained on duty until he arrested me. She stepped closer to the podium, voice lowering but sharp with intensity. If this can happen to me, with my credentials, with my position, with my decades of service, what happens to everyone else? What happens to the black mother at her daughter's graduation? The black man in his own home? The black professional at their workplace? If a Supreme Court justice can be arrested at her son's funeral, who is safe? Her words left the chamber in stunned silence. Every legislator felt the weight of the question. Every citizen watching on live stream confronted the reality of unchecked bias within law enforcement. The message was clear. No one, regardless of position or title, was immune from systemic prejudice. After her testimony, Lorraine returned to her office. She knew the lawsuit would eventually lead to a settlement, but she also knew the fight was about more than money. It was about accountability, about ensuring that patterns of misconduct could not continue unchecked. Her case had proven that the system could fail even the most prominent and powerful. Now, it was time to make it change. The courtroom in the Northern District of Georgia was packed. Reporters, legal scholars, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens filled every seat. The lawsuit filed by Justice Lorraine Hayes had reached its settlement phase, and the state of Georgia knew the stakes were enormous. The $18 million settlement was unprecedented, the largest wrongful arrest payout in state history, and it sent a message that systemic failures had consequences. Lorraine sat at the front table with Benjamin Crump and her legal team. Her black suit was simple, her hair pulled back. She had spent weeks reviewing every document, every police report, every video, every complaint. Nothing had been left unchecked. Edward Shields, the funeral director and Officer Ryan Callahan were named defendants, along with the Georgia State Patrol and the state itself. The evidence was overwhelming. The videos from multiple angles, the witness statements, Callahan's record of complaints, Shields' history of biased behavior, the handcuffs still leaving red marks on her wrists months later. The state's attorneys were quiet, their expressions grim. There was no real defense. Callahan had acted on a combination of racial bias, poor judgment, and years of unchecked misconduct. Shields had acted on assumptions, creating a chain reaction that made the arrest possible. And the Georgia State Patrol had ignored patterns of misconduct for over a decade. No argument could justify what had happened. Judge Samuel Franklin, presiding over the case, cleared his throat. "We are here to approve the settlement agreement between Justice Lorraine Hayes and the state of Georgia. This case represents a significant failure in law enforcement and systemic oversight. The settlement is $18 million, with additional liability from Maternal Rest Memorial Gardens." Lorraine allowed herself a small exhale. Justice had been recognized, but the real victory was accountability. She knew it could never fully erase the trauma, but it would prevent future tragedies if policies were changed. Outside the courtroom, news crews waited. Lorraine walked past them, calm, composed, but resolute. She spoke briefly into a microphone. "This settlement is not just about me. It's about ensuring accountability in law enforcement. It's about changing the system so that no one else is humiliated, arrested, or harmed because of assumptions rooted in racial bias." The media coverage exploded. Headlines splashed across the nation. Georgia pays $18 million to Supreme Court justice arrested at son's funeral. Justice Lorraine Hayes wins landmark settlement. Officer Ryan Callahan fired after racial bias arrest of judge. Public outrage shifted toward action. Legislators promised to revise policies, ensuring that officers with repeated complaints faced swift consequences. Funeral homes pledged training to prevent racial profiling during services. Officer Callahan had been terminated 6 weeks after the arrest. His career, built over 11 years, was effectively over at 38. His pension was revoked, his decertification finalized, and appeals denied. His public apology, calling the arrest an error in judgment, was universally rejected. There was no excuse, no justification. The repeated pattern of bias had caught up with him, leaving him professionally and personally destroyed. Edward Shields faced his own consequences. Fired from maternal rest, publicly shamed, and named in the federal lawsuit, his reputation was irrevocably damaged. His attempts to defend himself were ineffective against the overwhelming evidence of racial bias in his actions over 9 years. He issued one final statement. "I let my assumptions override reality. I'm sorry." But Lorraine and the public understood that apologies alone could not undo trauma. The Georgia State Patrol underwent a comprehensive review of officer conduct. Supervisors analyzed patterns of misconduct, training effectiveness, and accountability measures. Policies were revised. Officers with 3 sustained complaints related to bias or excessive force would face automatic termination. Internal affairs would be required to track patterns rather than treating incidents in isolation. The system, long criticized for leniency and oversight failures, began to change. Lorraine returned home after the courtroom proceedings, exhausted but resolute. The red marks on her wrists were long gone, but the memory of Callahan's hands, the handcuffs, the 200 witnesses, and her son's casket remained vivid. She knew that while money and policy changes could hold institutions accountable, the real work, cultural change, was ongoing. In interviews following the settlement, Lorraine spoke directly to the public. "This case is proof that systemic bias can touch anyone, regardless of status, credentials, or authority. I am a Supreme Court justice, but today's system failed me. We cannot allow similar violations to continue for ordinary citizens who who lacked the resources to fight back. She emphasized the lessons learned, the importance of verifying credentials, the dangers of assumptions based on race, and the need for immediate accountability when patterns of bias are documented. She called for widespread reforms, including mandatory bias training for law enforcement, penalties for officers who fail to act on complaints, and oversight for funeral directors and other public service positions that interact with vulnerable individuals. Months after the settlement, Lorraine returned to the Georgia Supreme Court. She resumed her work with renewed focus, determined to use her experience to strengthen civil rights protections. Her opinions began referencing systemic accountability in law enforcement, explicitly citing the dangers of unchecked bias. Students, colleagues, and citizens watched her closely, seeing a justice who had endured injustice and emerged stronger, ready to enforce not only the law but fairness itself. The broader impact of the case was undeniable. Other states began examining their law enforcement complaint processes. Civil rights organizations used Lorraine's case as an example of why automatic termination policies were necessary. Funeral homes nationwide reviewed their procedures, training staff to avoid racial profiling and assumptions that could escalate into violence or public humiliation. For Lorraine, the settlement was significant, but the real victory lay in awareness and change. She had transformed her trauma into a catalyst for reform, turning a moment of deep personal loss into a lesson for the entire nation. She frequently spoke at conferences, legal forums, and universities, emphasizing accountability, vigilance, and the importance of confronting systemic bias wherever it existed. Ultimately, the arrest at her son's funeral, the viral videos, the public outrage, and the $18 million settlement became more than just headlines. They became a case study in systemic failure and the power of resilience. Officer Ryan Callahan's career ended, Edward Shields faced consequences, and the Georgia State Patrol implemented reforms that would protect countless individuals in the future. Lorraine stood in her office one evening, reflecting on the journey. Her son Aaron would never be forgotten, and the injustice she endured had been transformed into progress. She had fought not only for herself, but for the mothers, fathers, and ordinary citizens who might face similar humiliation. The system had faltered, but change was possible, and her experience had sparked it. In her own words, she summarized the lesson. No one should be criminalized because of assumptions, racial bias, or unchecked authority. We must hold individuals and institutions accountable. Only then can we prevent history from repeating itself. Justice is more than a title. It is a responsibility we all share. The videos, the headlines, and the lawsuit would remain public record. The settlement would be remembered as a turning point for accountability in Georgia. But Lorraine knew the fight for justice was never truly over. Patterns of bias existed everywhere, and vigilance was required to ensure that no one else suffered as she had. The story of her arrest, her loss, and her eventual victory would be taught, discussed, and remembered. Not just as a tale of tragedy, but as a blueprint for accountability, resilience, and change.